Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. In this video, we are flipping through the pages of the book titled The Gypsies, Origin and Their Continuance and Destination, written by Samuel Roberts, where he describes the gypsies of the 1800s. He mentions that prior to the mid-1800s, it was believed, even for the Romani as we call them today, thought to have origins from Egypt. But historians tracing the dialect place their origins from region of Punjab, India. If you just caught me at this video, we are actually now in the third chapter, so if you're interested in grabbing the previous chapters, please go to my book playlist. And I want to say to my community subscribing here, welcome back. Hope that you're enjoying this. It has been interesting, and like I said, this book, what makes it a little bit challenging as I'm reading it is that it feels antiquarian in the I can almost feel the mind of this author and his passion for, I guess, the Christian faith and his desire to convert anyone that is not a Christian. But anyway, let me know if you pick that up as well. What makes this topic interesting, should one be desirous of inquiry, that is how were these people in that region, in that time, that were totally displaced, how were they able in such large amounts to travel through mountains, to traverse the sea, the oceans, and other terrains, to disperse themselves over the landscape of their unknown world? This author said that some people were saying that they just appeared out of nowhere, understanding the language and the custom of the land, as if they had always been this outlying community, only coming into town to sell their wares and offer their services, and then off to another community, because the season was over, and they were very nomadic. Yet what is most astonishing, that even to this day, this group of people that have their own language, albeit it is an oral language, not written in, whether it be a Romani from countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, Spain, France, Russia, Romania, Ukraine, and even those here in the United States, all these people whose descendants, we are told by historians, are people who migrated from the regions of Punjab and Rajasthan, tracing their ancestry back to India, all speak one main language. There may be some differences in dialects, but pretty much they understand each other. While there may appear to be a diversity among them, this one aspect has gone unchanged from hundreds of years since that initial migration. Now, while I'm not a historian, many of us have quick access to information due to the internet, and it is, or may be unfair for me to challenge the author when he said that the Romani did not have any stories or songs. On the contrary, there are many. I discovered a book titled Gypsy Folktales, which had lots of them, written by Francis Hines Groom, and it was written in 1899, a little under 50 years after the publication of Samuel Roberts' book that we're reading right now. Yet, we definitely have to give him credit. He was pretty bold and courageous. He would go out of his way to sit down with these people, the gypsies, the Romanis, and talk with them, learn about their culture, and offer them what he thought was something good for him, converting people to Christianity. That was his thing, and whether he's right or wrong, that's not what this book is about, and that's not for me to judge. So, but then, the fact that he would learn about them firsthand, that's pretty admirable, because then we, through this book, get to learn that side. What is most interesting, though, is when we think about the migration that happened, and, when did it happen, where did it happen, and how did these people just go all over, like so many parts of the world? I'm sure you know of a community of gypsies, or you have heard of them, or know of one, and it's like, it's everywhere. And like I said, it's been in the headlines. It's sad. It's been in the European headlines still to this day, as they're dealing with immigrations or immigrants into the land, or illegal immigrants. But when we consider according to historians, that India itself is amalgamation of immigrants. And going back to thousands of years of development, it was populated by multiple waves of migrants from Africa, Iran, and Central Asia. So, where is that true race when we start thinking about it? Where do these people come from? Who were the first? What did they look like? And then how do we evolve into the different peoples that we are? And how much do we can claim that this territory is mine and that's yours? That's just the human experiment, right? Or the human nature. Which society do you want to be a part of? And are you willing to give up what you know to blend in with another and hopefully, be received with open arms? As we navigate through the author's words, let's keep in mind that he is trying to make a case and connect the Romani to the biblical people who Isaiah and other prophets mentioned to be scattered, the scattered people, and prophecy that God will gather the people of Israel and Judah who were forced to leave their country. So, with that introduction and laying that foundation, I will turn the page. Modern Egypt. A quote by Holland. The land of Egypt is a land of wonders. And sure that I were dead to all attractions, that would not see, or seeing so unmoved, this Mephian miracle of ancient skill. The Nile, the lotused Nile of reverent story. The Sphinx, the hieroglyphic obelisks, the ruined catacombs, old Pharaoh's palace. All the wrecks and symbols thrown about this broken cradle of the infant arts. End quote. 40 years ago, Egypt would have been among the very last countries that would have been judged likely to become the stage of actions peculiarly interesting to the inhabitants of Europe, and particularly to those of this kingdom, a kingdom so detached and so remotely situated from it. Yet, within that short period, it has brought most highly to interest the different nations of Europe, but particularly the English nation. From the highest to the lowest, from the old to the young, from the most learned to the most illiterate, from the soldier to the priest, from the grave antiquary to the dashing young nobleman, from the philosopher to the schoolboy, all have of late been, more or less, interested in the transactions and the discoveries occurring in that remote country. Who could have imagined half a century ago that Egypt would be the country to which the armies of navies of England and France would be transported, at an enormous expense, to fight their battles, to dye the waters of Africa with their blood, and to whiten the fields of that distant quarter of the world with their bones? Who would have imagined that such a man as Bonaparte would have appeared to compel the attention of all the civilized world to that desolate country, or that such a man as Bolzoni would sojourn there to discover, to describe, and in fact to convey to this country works of art more extraordinary and stupendous than almost any with which the world was before acquainted? Works which have attracted and riveted the attention of persons of all degrees, ages, and acquirements, to Egypt and its inhabitants, both in their present and former state, in a degree beyond whatever could have been imagined possible. Who would have conceived that, of all these interesting and astonishing works, this country, a country divided from that by almost a quarter of the globe, should become the depository, at least, of such of them as were believed capable and worthy of being removed? Nay, even of many which were then thought to be beyond the strength of art of men to convey so far. All these things seem to point out this country as the proper place from whence inquiries relating to Egypt should proceed, and this as the proper time, then such information as is required should be disseminated. The Marquis Spinetto, in his Lectures on Egyptian Antiquities, says, "In considering these astonishing productions, We must really wonder how a nation which was so great as to erect these stupendous edifices could so far fall into oblivion, that even their language and method of writing are unknown to us. But our wonder will, if possible, increase to a higher degree when we take into consideration the materials which have been so modeled. They had only 4 sort of stones in general used for sculptures: the sandy, the calcareous, the breccia, and the granite. All expecting the first are very hard, and what is more singular, we do not know with what tools they were cut. We know by experience that the tools of the present day will not cut granite without great difficulty. And Bolzoni, who had made so many experiments on this stone, doubts whether we could give it the smoothness and surface which we see in Egypt. On the calcareous stones, the figures have angles so sharp that the best tempered chisels of our times could not produce the like. It is so hard that it breaks more like glass than stone, and yet these materials, they have produced the most exquisite specimens of architecture and sculpture. For in both these arts their productions have a boldness of execution that has never been equaled by any other nation. The gigantic statues of Greece and Rome are but dwarfs and pygmies when compared to those of Karnak, Luxor, Esne, Dendera, and indeed of the whole of Egypt and Nubia. They have made besides considerable progress in several manufactures, even to a degree which is really astonishing. Their linen manufacture had a perfection equal to our own. In many of their figures we observe their garments quite transparent, and among the folding of the mummies, Bolzoni observed cloth quite as fine as our common muslin, being very strong and of an equal texture. They had also the art of tanning leather and staining it with various colors as we do Morocco, and actually knew the mode of embossing it. Many specimens of the sort have been found with figures impressed on the leather quite raised. The same may be said of their art in making glass, some of which was of a beautiful black color and so perfect as to resemble the natural obsidian. Of such glass we made the celebrated statue of Menelaus. This information we gather from Pliny, who makes use of this observation to prove that the art of manufacturing glass was very ancient. Besides enameling, the art of gilding was in great perfection among them, and they knew how to beat gold nearly as thin as ours. For Bolzoni found many ornaments of the kind, and a leaf of gold which appeared to him to be very fine and of a brighter color than we often see. They knew also how to cast copper and to form it into sheets, and they had a metallic composition not unlike our lead, but of greater tenacity. Carved works were very common and in great perfection, particularly in the proportion of their figures. And the art of varnishing and baking the varnish on clay was in such perfection that the most enlightened travelers had doubted whether they could be equaled at present. I have already noticed their skill and perfection in painting and in the blending of the colors. Indeed, the more I consider what they have done and what they were capable of doing, the more I am lost in amazement. For as most of the stupendous works are of the highest antiquity, they must have been the production of their artists in the hierarchic government, and so near to the deluge that even adopting our older system of the Septuagint chronology, a man can hardly conceive how a nation could, in so short a time, render habitable the whole valley of the Nile, and acquire such knowledge, and make so great a proficiency in most sciences, and in most manufactures, and in all the arts. A few extracts from Bolzoni's narrative of discoveries and operations in Egypt may serve to shew more clearly the ancient and present state of that extraordinary part of the world, and to increase in a proportionate degree the interest and importance of the subject of this work. Respecting the city of the 100 gates, Bolzoni thus writes, "On the 22nd, we saw for the first time the ruins of the great Thebes, and landed at Luxor. Here I beg the reader to observe that but very imperfect ideas can be formed of the extensive ruins of Thebes, even from the accounts of the most skillful and accurate travelers. It is impossible to imagine the scene displayed without seeing it. The most sublime ideas that can be formed from the most magnificent specimens of our present architecture would give a very incorrect picture of these ruins. For such is the difference not only in magnitude, but in form, proportion, and construction that even the pencil can convey but a faint idea of the whole. It appeared to me like entering a city of giants who, after a long conflict, were all destroyed, leaving the ruins of their various temples as the only proofs of their former existence. The Temple of Luxor presents to the traveler at once one of the most splendid groups of Egyptian grandeur. The extensive propylaeon with the two obelisks and colossal statues in the front, the thick groups of enormous columns, the variety of apartments, and the sanctuary it contains. The beautiful ornaments which adorn every part of the walls and columns described by Mr. Hamilton cause in the astonished traveler an oblivion of all that has been seen before. If his attention be attracted to the north side of Thebes by the towering remains that project a great height above the palm trees, he will gradually enter that forest-like assemblage of ruins of temples wherein are obelisk, colossi, sphinxes, portals, and an endless number of other astonishing objects that will convince him at once of the impossibility of a description. On the west side of the Nile, still the traveler finds himself among wonders. The temples of Gomorrah, Menominium, and Medinet Abu attest the extent of the great city on that side. The unraveled colossal figures in the plain of Thebes, the number of tombs excavated in the rocks, those in the great valley of the kings, with their paintings, sculptures, mummies, sarcophagi, figures, etc., are all subjects worthy of the admiration of the traveler, who will not fail to wonder how a nation, which was once so great as to erect these stupendous edifices, could so far fall into oblivion that even their language and writings are totally unknown to us. The bust only of the statue of Memnon, now deposited in the British Museum, weighs not less than 10 or 12 tons. The following is the description of the exterior of the temple of Ipsambul. It is 117 feet wide and 86 feet high. The height from the top of the cornice to the top of the door being 66 feet 6 inches, and the height of the door 20 feet. There are 4 enormous sitting colossi, the largest in Egypt or Nubia, except the Great Sphinx at the pyramids, to which they approach in the proportion of nearly 2/3. From the shoulder to the elbow they measure 15 feet 6 inches. The ears 3 feet 6 inches, the face 7 feet, the beard 5 feet 6 inches, across the shoulder 20 feet 4 inches. Their height is about 51 feet, not including the caps, which are about 14 feet. There are only 2 of these colossi in sight. One is still buried under the sand, and the other, which is near the door, is half fallen down and buried also. On the top of the door is a colossal figure of Osiris, 20 feet high, with 2 colossal hieroglyphic figures, one on each side looking towards it. On the top of the temple is a cornice with hieroglyphics, a torus, and frieze under it. The cornice is 6 feet wide, the frieze 4 feet. Above the cornice is a row of sitting monkeys, 8 feet high and 6 across the shoulders. They are 21 in number. This temple was nearly 2/3 buried under the sand, of which we removed 31 feet before we came to the upper part of the door. It must have a very fine landing place, which is now totally buried under the sand. This temple is only one of many other such, excavated out of the solid rock in different parts of Egypt. The interior is in corresponding style of vast magnificence, We entered, says the indefatigable Bolzoni, into a large pronaos 57 feet long and 52 wide, supported by 2 rows of square pillars in a line from the front door to the door of the sekos. Each pillar has a figure not unlike those at Medinet Abu, finely executed and very little injured by time. The tops of their turbans reach the ceiling, which is about 30 feet high. The pillars are 5 feet and a half square. But these and the walls are covered with beautiful hieroglyphics, the style of which is somewhat superior, or at least bolder, than that of any others known in Egypt, not only in workmanship, but also in the subjects. They exhibit battles, storming of castles, triumphs over the Ethiopians, sacrifices, etc., etc. The numerous other rooms, all of which are minutely described, are in corresponding style of a sublime grandeur. The tombs which Mr. Belzoni examined were almost innumerable. The expense, the care, and the constant attention paid by the Egyptians to their dead were, he observes, almost incredible. Many of the bodies appeared to have been carefully wrapped in linen of different degrees of fineness at different and distant periods. In some of the chambers of the tombs were the mummies of cows, sheep, monkeys, crocodiles, bats, and other animals intermixed with human bodies. And one tomb was filled with nothing but cats, carefully folded in red and white linen, the head covered by a mask representing the cat and made of the same linen. The danger, the difficulties, and the unpleasantness of visiting these mansions of the deed of former ages is thus interestingly described by the dauntless traveler. Of some of these tombs, many persons could not withstand the suffocating air which often causes fainting. A vast quantity of dust rises so fine that it penetrates the throat and nostrils and chokes the nose and mouth to such a degree that it requires great power of lungs to resist it and the strong effluvia of the mummies. This is not all. The passages where the bodies are roughly cut in the rocks, and the falling of the sand from the upper part of the ceiling of the passage causes it to be nearly filled up. In some places, there's not more than the vacancy of a foot left, which you must contrive to pass through in a creeping posture like a snail, on a pointed and keen stones that cut like glass. After getting through 3 passages, some of them 200 or 300 yards long, you generally find a more commodious place, perhaps high enough to sit. But what a place of rest, surrounded by bodies, by heaps of mummies in all directions, which, previous to my being accustomed to the sight, impressed me with horror. The blackness of the walls, the faint light given by the candles or torches, for want of air, the different objects that surrounded me, seeming to converse with each other, and the Arabs with the candles or torches in their hands, naked and covered with dust, themselves resembling living mummies, absolutely formed a scene that cannot be described. In such a situation I found myself several times, and often returned exhausted and fainting, till at last I became inured to it, and indifferent to what I suffered, except from the dust, which never failed to choke my throat and nose. Though fortunately I am destitute of the sense of smelling, I could taste that the mummies were rather unpleasant to swallow. After the exertion of entering into such a place through a passage of 50, 100, 300, or perhaps 600 yards, nearly overcome, I sought a resting place, found one, and contrived to sit. But when my weight bore on the body of an Egyptian, it crushed it like a bandbox. I naturally had recourse to my hands to sustain my weight, but they found no better support, so that I sunk altogether among the broken mummies with a crash of bones, rags, and wooden cases, which raised such a dust as kept me motionless for a quarter of an hour, waiting till it subsided again. I could not remove from the place, however, without increasing it, and every step that I took I crushed a mummy in some part or other. Once I was conducted from such a place to another resembling it, through a passage about 20 feet in length, and no wider than that a body could be forced through. It was choked with mummies, and I could not pass without putting my face in contact with that of some decayed Egyptian. But as the passage inclined towards my own weight helped me on. However, I could not avoid being covered with bones, heads, arms, and legs rolling from above. Thus I proceeded from one cave to another, all full of mummies piled up in various ways, some standing, some lying, and some on their heads. The purpose of my researches was to rob the Egyptians of their papyri, of which I found a few hidden in their breasts, under their arms, in the space above their knees, or on their legs, and covered by the numerous folds of the cloth that enveloped the mummy. The people of Gornu, who made a trade of antiquities of this sort, are very jealous of strangers, and keep them as secret as possible, deceiving travelers by pretending that they have arrived at the end of the pits, when they are scarcely at their entrance. I could never prevail on them to conduct me into these places before this, my second voyage, when I succeeded in obtaining admission into any caves where mummies were to be seen. Other tombs were discovered, particularly in Babal el-Muluk, even more capacious than these. Here it was that the unwearied searcher discovered a tomb which he says richly repaid him for the trouble and hazard that attended all his researches. The day on which he made the discovery he considers as the most fortunate of his life, and the tomb and its contents and the most superb and splendid remains of Egyptian antiquities. This tomb the traveler conceives to be that of Pharaoh Necho, and the superb sarcophagus which was there found, and which is or was in the British Museum, he conceives to be the one which contained the body of a demigod, the tempter of Israel to sin, of whom the Lord declared, "Behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which had said, My river is mine own, and I have made it myself, but I will put hooks in thy jaws. I will leave thee thrown into the wilderness, thee and all the fish of thy rivers. Behold, therefore, I am against thy rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate, from the tower of Syene even unto the borders of Ethiopia. And I will make the land of Egypt desolate, even among the countries that are desolate, and her cities among the cities that are laid waste. And I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations, and I will disperse them through the countries." Supposing, as there appear to be strong grounds to do, that the Gypsies are the descendants of the ancient Egyptians, what an awful and impressive fulfillment do they afford of these striking denunciations of the divine wrath against a people and nation, then more powerful and splendid than any nation upon the earth. The discovery of all these magnificent remains of the former grandeur of that people, and the discovery of the remnant of that people at this day scattered among the nations and fallen upon the open fields of the uncircumcised, severe strikingly to illustrate and to fulfill these extraordinary predictions. The Gypsies are now outcast, even among the most despised people and nations. The most striking production of the arts, the most splendid ornaments of their palaces, their temples, and their tombs are brought and exhibited as objects of curiosity to a country of which they, the ancient Egyptians, had never heard the name. A country whose inhabitants were then little better than naked painted savages wandering wild in the depths of their forest. Among these people and nation do the descendants of the proud Egyptians wander as outcast vagrants, while the gods and the idols of their forefathers are there exhibited as mementos of God's power and as objects to excite astonishment, commiseration, or scorn, the useless ornaments of palaces or the playthings of children. The bodies of their ancestors, their priests, their nobles, their kings, and their queens, which they vainly imagined they had rendered immortal, immovable, and undiscoverable, are now exhibited in that despised country to the gaze and contempt of the lowest of the rabble, or are converted, it is affirmed, into nauseous, sickening medicines for the cure of loathsome diseases. If such things and occurrences as these were predicted more than 2,000 years ago to happen, and have now, as then predicted, come to pass, surely it must be the Lord's doing. That such events were then predicted, we do know from unquestionable authority. That such occurrences are now taking place, we have the testimony of our senses to prove. Let us, then, neither shut our eyes nor our ears, nor wilfully withhold the free exercise of our understandings, and we cannot, I think, remain either uninterested or unconvinced. The whole description of this wonderful and splendid tomb of Pharaoh Necho and the sarcophagus which was supposed to have contained the body of that monarch, long since stolen and probably destroyed, are highly interesting. As, however, the sarcophagus itself is now in this country, and an exact model of the different departments of the wonderful tomb has been there exhibited, it is unnecessary to insert the description of them here. All these things serve to show that the descriptions of the magnificence and power of the Egyptians have not been exaggerated either by sacred or profane historians. The accounts furnished by Belzoni and other travelers show that the degree of desolation and misery predicted by the prophets to fall upon Egypt was not beyond what is now seen and experienced in that country. And the present condition of the gypsies affords, in almost every country of Europe, and even America, an instance of a people claiming to be Egyptians, in circumstances fully corresponding with those predicted to happen to that race of human beings. The countenances, the complexion, and the assertions of the gypsies all corroborate the supposition of their being that scattered people, who are to be brought, eventually, out of every country whither they were driven, and in the open fields of which they were dispersed. That people, whom the Lord will cause to return into the land of Pathros, and into the land of their habitation, there to know him. In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and shall perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite it and heal it. And they shall return even to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. Isaiah chapter 19. End of chapter. We continue on with the reading of the book The Gypsies, their origin, continuance, and destination, as clearly foretold in the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel by Samuel Roberts in the next video, where he takes us into the next chapter titled The Jews, their dispersion and restoration, as well as how are they connected with the Gypsies.